So good to see you today. Those of you that are online, I'm glad that you can see me, even though I can't see you. It is great to get the chance to share with you here at the Kaufman campus. I love the Christmas season. For me, Christmas actually begins every year when our church puts up our first Christmas decoration, which is always a sharing Christmas tree. And so yesterday, my family and I sat down, talked about what it is that we were going to be able to contribute and how many gift cards we were going to be able to purchase, because we really are committed, both as a family and as a church family, to making a very bold statement in our community. $100,000 going to help people not inside of our ministry, but all of them outside of our ministry. Hopefully some of them will be impacted by the gospel message that we're able to deliver in the days ahead. And I am grateful for the fact that you have joined us in that, because quite frankly, the only way we make that statement louder is if your voice joins in on it and you are a part of this, just kind of giving in proportion to how God has already given to you. And that's, once again, we're unashamedly asking for that, because we're not asking you to give to us, we're asking you to give through us. And we know that together we will be successful at proclaiming the name of Christ by caring for those that are the most marginalized in our society. Today we begin a new series. Every year we do some sort of Christmas series, and it's usually 2 Sundays after Thanksgiving. And today we begin one called He Shall Be Called, which is about the names of Christ. You ever think about the counsel that you get in life? I mean, when you think about the friends that you follow, or the news that you pay attention to, or the social media that you scroll, and you think to yourself, I need some better advice. I need some better voices speaking into my life. We see this in young people. When I was a youth minister, I always was kind of humored by the 14-year-old who needs some really important life advice. And you know where they turn for that? To another 14-year-old. And we all laugh about that, but it's also true that we do the same thing in our own lives, is that we actually are tempted to ignore the voices that matter the most and buy into the voices of society, and maybe even kind of that inner lawyer, that voice of the flesh that's telling us to do wrong and sinful things. We listen to the wrong voices on a regular basis. I know that I do. And what exposes this as much as anything is my failure, and my prideful failure, to want to listen to read directions when I have something that I need to do, some sort of project that I need to finish. About 25 years ago, I was actually commissioned to put together a game room at the youth group where I actually served. And while I was there, I went, and the finishing touches was a foosball table. And so I went and bought a foosball table. Problem was, it wasn't completely put together. And so when I went and got the foosball table, I brought it back and I looked at it, and it wasn't overly complex. All you basically had to do was to put on the legs and a couple of nets and the scoring thing. It really wasn't that big of a deal. And so I didn't want to read the 30-page booklet on how to put together this foosball table. And so I immediately began work on it, flipped it over upside down, took these lock bolts, I put them in place. And when I flipped over the foosball table, it was 2.5 feet tall, because I had put the legs on upside down. I don't know how I did it. Don't ask me. It's just I wasn't listening to. Here's what I learned that day. When putting together a foosball table, it is wise to consult the foosball table maker. When it comes to living life, there is nothing more important than consulting the giver of life himself. We've got to ask ourselves, where are we going to get our counsel? Because that answer determines who is calling the shots in our lives. The series that we begin today is actually a Christmas prophecy found in the book of Isaiah. And that's interesting, because Isaiah was written 700 years before the very first Christmas. And this prophecy was given to a guy named Ahaz, and he received it from Isaiah. And Isaiah was speaking to all the people of Israel. And this prophecy was making a declaration that even though it appeared that things were going really poorly in Israel at that particular moment, that God was going to provide for man what man could not provide for himself, that God was going to bring salvation, that God was going to do something for people that people, even a king like Ahaz, could not do for themselves. And God is going to give them some hope by delivering this prophecy that we'll read now. Isaiah 9:6. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. And his name shall be called. Remember, that's the series itself. Here are the names we're going to be looking at. Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end. The throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. Now, all of these names and titles that are ascribed to this coming ruler, this coming Messiah, would be inappropriate if they were describing an ordinary baby. But this was no ordinary baby. This wasn't just God's messenger. This wasn't just God's appointed person. This actually was God. And they wanted to, at this point, I'm sure that Ahaz was grateful to hear that he would come as a wonderful counselor, because Ahaz had all kinds of counselors around him, but none of them would be considered wonderful. None of them would even have been considered good at this particular point, because they were all about themselves. They weren't about the kingdom of Israel. They certainly weren't about the kingdom of God. They were all about self-promotion. And when Ahaz hears that this coming Messiah is going to be a wonderful counselor, he's so very encouraged. There's only one problem. It's going to be a baby. And the baby has to grow up, if you will, in order to rule. And so the best that Ahaz could hope for was that this would be his heir, because he heard the Hebrew words, Pele Yoez. That's what it means, wonderful counselor. Pele Yoez. Pele meaning wonderful, amazing, incomprehensible, exceptional, miraculous. Yoez meaning advisor, purpose giver, or counselor. This is who would come. And we don't see this on full display for another 700 years until we see the life and work of Jesus Christ. And we see Jesus referring to himself as a physician, referring to himself as a counselor. In John chapter 14, Jesus actually, when he's talking about the coming counselor, refers to himself as a counselor and says that the one that's coming will guide you in all truth and will lead you to the truth. And the truth is actually, and this is a little bit of a twist, the truth is a person. Now, there's a lot of wisdom that we can gain through therapists and through counseling. I've personally learned a lot from partnering with them, and as a society, we've gotten pretty familiar with most of their techniques. There is no shame and no stigma to going to see a therapist. As a matter of fact, it's become a little bit trendy, and that's fine as long as you go to a good therapist. And you might be saying, well, great, Pastor, but what is a good therapist? Well, I'm going to give you some core values and techniques that every single good therapist should practice, and we will then take some time and kind of compare and contrast the good counselor that you could go to today with the wonderful counselor that God sent in Jesus Christ. Because honestly, good counselors today borrow from the wisdom of God. And when we look at the wisdom of God, we're able to see the grace of God, which leads us to the salvation of God. And so my hope today is that as we look at these principles that are oftentimes put in place not only by Christian counselors, but also by secular counselors, things that you need to know if you're going to see one, how it's even more true when it comes to how we relate to Jesus Christ as the wonderful counselor. So the first thing is you got to be honest. You got to be honest. I mean, this is where it starts. Don't waste your money going and see a counselor or a therapist if for whatever reason you aren't willing to be honest. If you're going to try to spin and duck and dodge and do all these things, listen, you will never arrive at true healing. Honestly, you will not ever arrive there. I've got people all the time, they do this. It's called deflection. They come in and they think they're keeping me at arm's length, but in reality, they're hamstringing the healing process. There is a need to be honest, and it's not just true when you go and see a good professional counselor. It's also true when you encounter the wonderful counselor. In John chapter 4, there's a story about a woman that in the middle of the day comes to draw water from the well. And this woman is really interesting because she doesn't come when most women come at the beginning of the day or the end of the day. She came in the middle of the day, so she was obviously trying to avoid someone or something. And I imagine she was trying to avoid any kind of conversation, but she gets there and there's Jesus. And Jesus does what Jesus do. He starts a conversation with her and he says this. He says, he asks her for some water and they get into this dialogue and he tells her to go and get her husband. And she says, I don't have a husband. And that's like a half truth because it's kind of true. I mean, she doesn't. He says, you're right. You actually have had 5 husbands, and the one you're shacking up with now is not your husband either. And we don't really know all that went into those things, but here's what we know. She is living with a great deal of pain, and what she immediately does is the same thing that we tend to do, is she begins to deflect, right? She wants to have a conversation about politics. And when that doesn't work, she wants to have a conversation about religious practices. And she deflects, trying to avoid the real pain that she's experiencing in her life. Similarly, I think that we're fearful that if all the details about our life actually come out, that God won't actually heal, that he'll recognize that we're damaged goods. And I would say to you today that this is a crazy idea that you and I are damaged goods and therefore Jesus would ignore us. As a matter of fact, at the very beginning of his ministry in Mark chapter 2, Jesus says, I'm a physician. I have come to speak into and heal those people that are sick. I didn't come to coronate the successful or reward the faithful. I came to heal those people that were honest enough to recognize their brokenness. I put things back together. And he does miracle after miracle to validate this so that you and I and all the people in that day as well could recognize that he is a physician. He is a counselor. He is about bringing healing to those who need it. As a matter of fact, listen, we sometimes act like Jesus had like his ministry, his life was like a 33-year magic show. That wasn't the case. I can't think of a single miracle that Jesus did that wasn't characterized by meeting a need. He always saw a need. And let me tell you why that's so important today. Because if you came in here today and you feel like you've got a part of you that's hurting, that's broken, you've got an injury, a problem you can't solve, you've got a wound that just won't heal, then I want you to understand that that does not disqualify you. It actually brings you into the place where a miracle can happen today, in this moment. It is possible that healing really and truly begins, but you got to start by being honest. And let me let you in on a little secret. The enemy doesn't want you to know this, but the wonderful counselor, he's not like a good counselor in that he already knows. You don't have to tell him anything. The only person you're fooling by withholding that information is you. And I know this because I did it for 25 years. I've been fairly forthright about that when I was between 8 and 9 years old, I was sexually assaulted by an 8th and 9th grader. And it was a very difficult time in my life, of course. And I decided that I would just completely and totally repress it. And so for 25 years, I never spoke of it. I wouldn't even let myself think about it. I would do everything I could, and it would come up probably once or twice a week in my mind, but I would always just ignore it. And I never spoke to anybody about it. I never told any friends. I never told any spiritual mentors. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell my wife. I didn't tell anybody about this. It wasn't until I was 33 years of age that I spoke of it. And here's what you need to know is this is way more common than you think. Actually, statistics tell us that 1 out of 4 females and 1 out of 6 males have experienced something similar to this. And if that's the case in your life, I would certainly want to help you find somebody to connect with. You can certainly email me by going through the website if that's helpful. But here's what I know. As I kind of think back through that series, what happened to me when I was 8 or 9 years old was not nearly as damaging as keeping a secret for 25 years. I can take you to the place where I was sitting at Cracker Barrel. Across from me was Randy Wade. I had a young relationship. We'd been friends for about 5 years, and just almost accidentally, it slipped out of my mouth what had happened. And when it did, I was like, oop. Because I knew once I had spoken it, it was real. And I was concerned that I was going to be damaged goods. I was concerned that my parents would be embarrassed. I was concerned that the church wouldn't follow me. I was concerned in so many different areas. I mean, lies that Satan had told me. Concerned that my wife was going to think that I liked people that had same-sex attraction issues. I mean, it's just crazy stuff that the enemy had convinced me of. I had bought into all of that. And what I would say to you today is that the pathway to healing was honesty. And what's brought me to this place today that I can tell this story almost without getting emotional. And the part that makes me emotional is the healing that took place. I'm not even emotional about what happened back then. It's what God is doing today. But it starts, my friends, with you and I being honest with the pain that we are experiencing. If you want to see results when you're interacting with a good counselor, here's the second thing you've got to do. You've got to desire change. You've got to want to change. Quite frankly, the human will is a very strong thing. Investment in desire, that's really, really important. When we sometimes come in contact with someone who needs to go see a counselor, needs to go see a therapist, and they find themselves in dire financial straits, as a church, we will actually get them some help, and will help pay for it. But all of these therapists that we refer people to, they insist that we not pay for all of it because they want them to have some investment and desire because they recognize that that's part of the healing, right? It's like if someone gives you a club membership, you're not going to that club. If you pay for the club membership, you're either going to cash it in or you're going to go to the thing because you've made some investment. And what I would say to you today is that often people come to me regularly and we'll be talking and they'll say, hey, can you meet with my husband? Can you meet with my wife? Can you meet with my kids? I want you to talk with them. And I'm like, sure, I'd be happy to meet with them. Do they want to meet? And they'd say, no, not really. I don't think they want to meet, but I'm thinking you can encourage them to. And I'm like, hey, you have way more trust in my powers of persuasion than I actually do. I can promise you that, because an unwilling person may actually embrace the dysfunction. They've grown comfortable with it over time. When I was in social psychology back when I was in college at Baylor, I was taking a class on criminology. It was one of the requirements. And we had some discussion about prisoners that were in prison for more than like 10 years, some of them 20 or 30 years before they were paroled. And when they got out, one of the common things that they would do is they would drive to the parking lot outside the prison where they had been incarcerated for so many years, and they would just sit there and long for the stability and security that they had experienced when they were inside of the prison. That's great. You're in prison, though. Do you not understand it? You need the truth to set you free, and you have to decide that what you want is to be free. You've got to have some desire. Maybe that's why Jesus says in John 5 to an invalid that had been there for 38 years, and Jesus sees him lying there, and he knew that he had already been there for a long time. He'd gotten used to it. It probably felt normal, and he said to him, do you want to be healed? It's like, nah, I kind of like scooting around with my arms. It's helping me develop some biceps. I mean, is that what no. Or in Mark chapter 10, there's this blind man who's calling out to Jesus. They're like, hey, Jesus wants to talk to you. And it says he's throwing off his cloak. He sprang up. He came to Jesus, and Jesus said to him, what do you want me to do for you? And the blind man said, maybe a puppy. No, that's not what he says. He says, Rabbi, let me recover my sight. And Jesus said to him, go your way, your faith has made you well. And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. But you know what's interesting? These questions aren't nearly as dumb as they seem. Because if there is a gift to be given and it is not received, if the person that's receiving it does not have open hands, it doesn't matter how valuable the gift is. If it's not received, it will be of no use. It will not help you in the healing process. But if you don't want input, then nothing will change. James actually, when he's talking about the Bible and the truth of God, the counsel of God, he actually says it's kind of like a mirror, right? And so that an individual who looks in the full-length mirror is able to see all of their flaws and inadequacies. But it's possible for you to walk away and to either accidentally or intentionally ignore all the things that the mirror said was true. As long as I go like a long period of time not looking in the mirror, I usually tell myself that I look like Michael B. Jordan. And there's a few differences, but you have to look hard to find them. But sorry about that. But here's what I would say. You can tell yourself anything. And so sometimes we don't even have a mirror, right? And so we need like a good counselor to say, hey, you got something stuck in your teeth, or you got a bat in the cave, or your fly is down. And someone gives you good counsel when they tell you that stuff, right? And listen, if that ever is true of me and you don't tell me, we are no longer friends. I want you to hear me say that, okay? And here's what I would say about it. And here's what really kind of concerns me about it. Why are we so quick to address those kind of issues and so slow to address it when it's something spiritual? I submit to you that it's possible that we are more concerned with our outward appearance than we are with the condition of our soul. Which brings us to our third and final thing. You got to get this from a visit with a good counselor. You got to follow the counsel. I mean, that's the thing, right? You can be honest about it. You can actually receive the counsel. But if you don't put it into practice, then you don't begin the process. I think pretty much everybody wants the end result, but nobody wants to do the hard work that it takes to actually get there. Whether it be a financial struggle that you find yourself dealing with, a relational issue, maybe it's an addiction issue, a weight issue, whatever it is. Most people know where they want to go. They just don't take the steps that they need in order to get to that place. I tell people regularly, look, you didn't get to this place of dysfunction overnight. You're probably not getting out of it overnight. I tell people regularly that God's not in the habit of just kind of waving a magic wand and then bringing about redemption in that person's life just kind of miraculously, at least not at first. It almost always begins with a process. So I'm always leery of the evangelist who tells the story like, I was a pimp and a drug dealer back in the 80s, and I wandered into a tent revival, and I walked the aisle and fell on my knees and received Jesus. And from that point forward, I've never popped another pill. I've never lusted over another woman. I've never busted out in anger. Not one single time. I've never had a racist thought. And I'm like, listen, that's great. And I'm glad that God gave it to you, my brother. But here, that is not most people's experience. For most people, they will begin the process of unlearning the patterns that they have been walking in for so long. Because when you get saved, your soul gets saved, but your body does not. You see, this process is kind of on display in the life of Jesus. We see it regularly, and I'll give you a couple of examples. In John chapter 9, there's this guy who's blind, and Jesus spits on the ground, and he made mud with saliva, and he anointed the man's eyes and with the mud, and he said, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he went and washed, and he came back seeing. So what does the wonderful counselor do here? He gives him a step to take, and after that step, there's another step, and there's another step, and every good counselor is going to do exactly that. But the wonderful counselor has a deeper intention and meaning. And in Matthew 17, he says, however, he's talking to the disciples who are struggling to pay the taxes. And Jesus says, go to the sea, cast a hook, and take the first fish that comes up. And when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and yourself. If you're going to do a magic trick, Jesus, why not just pull the shekel out of somebody's ear? Why give them a series of steps on how to make this thing happen? And I think it's because of this. Because you actually grow in your trust of the wonderful counselor when you follow his wonderful counsel. You see, you've got to take what it is that the wisdom of God puts out there, and you've got to put it into practice. And the experience that you have in your life will not be based upon whether or not you've received the information, but whether or not you put the information into practice. One of the most practical sermons ever preached is the Sermon on the Mount. It's got these issues, some issues that I don't really struggle with any of them, but maybe you do. Things like materialism and worry, and I'm kidding, I do struggle with these things, and contentment and anger and struggle and how you treat other people. I mean, this is a practical message, and at the end of the message, Jesus says these words. He says, whoever hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house upon the rock. You see, we sometimes just gloss over that. What Jesus is saying is out there's thousands of people, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, maybe 5,000 people. I've been in Israel where they say that this probably happened. And Jesus is preaching this message and he says, look, all of you have heard the information, but whether or not your experience will be different when the storm comes will be determined by whether or not you've taken the information that I've just given and you've put it into practice. You see, that's what needs to happen in our lives. Charles Spurgeon, I think he said it this way, you got to put your yes on the table. That's what it looks like. You put your yes on the table, meaning before you know what the question is, before you know what the instructions are, before you know where the next step is going to lead you, you say yes. And honestly, this is kind of what the Christian life is all about. And when you put your yes on the table and you've already predetermined that you will do what it is that he tells you to do, which once again is kind of the essence of the Christian life. It doesn't mean that everything is all of a sudden perfect. What it does mean is when he shows you an area of disobedience, you obey first because he is the wonderful counselor. And when you get that, I mean, you kind of get to the place where you're like, but if I end, you got those excuses that kind of bump around in your head, or maybe people on the outside tell you, and you begin to buy into these lies. Like, but if I end the relationship, I will be lonely. If I give generously now, I won't be able to retire extravagantly later. If I speak the truth, I won't be liked. If I say no, I'll be ostracized. If I don't cheat, I will fall behind. Listen carefully. You need to recognize that the essence of the Christian life is saying yes before you even know what the direction actually is. It's like writing a blank check. There's too many young people in here. It's like leaving an open Venmo. It's a totally different thing, right? I mean, a blank check. I mean, we get what a blank check is, right? I mean, you sign the check, you put the date on it, you use a check from your checking account, and you give it to someone, and then they later fill in the amount. And here's the most important thing you need to know when you are writing a blank check to somebody. Do you trust that somebody? Because that person can clean you out. And God is using the process and all of the systems around it to build trust between you and God the Father. See, that's why at the end of the day, it's not about the wonderful counsel. It's about the wonderful counselor. And in John 14, that wonderful counselor says this: I am the way, I'm the truth, I'm the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. Let me break it down. A good counselor points you down the way. The wonderful counselor is the way. A good counselor will tell you the truth. The wonderful counselor is the truth. A good counselor will tell you how to live. But the wonderful counselor, he is the life. And at the end of the day, when you read that verse, what he provides is not advice, but access, because no one comes to the Father but by me. Do you recognize what that means? He provides access to God where all healing is found. And that's where the similarities end. Because the fourth area is payment. They both require payment, it's just completely different. You see, the good counselor at the end of 50 minutes or so will say goodbye. If they're a Christian, probably say a prayer. And they'll send you to the front desk to settle accounts, to make a payment. The wonderful counselor has already paid that price in full. You see, that's the real beauty of the Christmas gift. Because there have been lots of babies that have grown up to be king, but only one king that became a baby. And that's the beauty of Christmas. I mean, don't just leave him there, though, as the 8-pound, 6-ounce newborn baby Jesus. Thank you, Ricky Bobby. No gold diapers. Because his birth would lead to his life, and his life would lead to his death. And his death would lead back to his life, which would lead to life for us. You see, that's why 2 Corinthians 5:21 is such a powerful verse in my life. It says, for our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, in order that we might become the righteousness of God. Righteous payment was needed, and righteous payment was given. And in 2020, if you're honest about your need, and if you're willing to receive that advice and to put that yes on the table, then healing will actually begin. Because he told Ahaz that he's coming to bring righteousness. And that's exactly what he sent in Jesus Christ. And I would tell you that that can be true in your life as well, because I've experienced it. Because I'll let you know that the day that healing happened in my life was not when I repressed what happened to me day after day, week after week, year after year for 25 years. But after 33 years, when I began the process of untangling what had been wound up inside of my soul, I found that God the Father took Jesus to the wound. And that physician, that counselor, is where I finally found healing. And I'm convinced the same can be true for you today. Not because I'm a salesman, but because I'm a satisfied customer. Put your yes on the table and watch the healing follow. Father, I thank you for each person in this room that's here. I know that there's a journey that everyone finds themselves on, and today I'm asking for healing, for your Spirit to just light over all of us, and that there would be something supernatural that would happen wherever the listener is, and that today there would be new life offered, received, and marked down for good. And it is in Jesus' holy and mighty name we pray.